Leaving the MCG, I looked up, and in front of me was a superhero. It was my first time using that gate in ages, and I'd moved to the other side of town, so I never usually needed it. And so I stumbled onto the statue of Keith Miller, this huge metal man bounding down into the crease. The sculpture was trying to do his best with his perfect Brylcreem hair, but the face is not exactly as I remember Keith Miller. But of all the legends of the MCG, perhaps none deserved a statue more than him. He played at the ground in Australian rules football when he was representing St Kilda. Then he played for Victoria in the days where Shield crowds were huge, and then he played Test for Australia. He was a 3-time MCG star, an absolute legend of that place. And when Miller died, I was working in the city, and his funeral was around the corner, and I darted out of the office and ran down there. But when I arrived, I felt weird, like I had not done enough to even go in and pay my respects. So I sat on the steps instead. And I tell you this, that's how high I hold him in regard. And the statue of him kind of looms down at you as well. The brass and his height makes him stand out. And if you position yourself in the right spot, it's like you're facing up to him and you're about to be dismissed. He is huge and intimidating, kind of no matter how you look at it, spiritually or just this brass statue. And yet, it almost never feels this way. That's because as big as his statue is, and the other ones there as well, it's nothing more than a fleck compared to the MCG. This ground is so massive that even the stars that made it feel small. The MCG puts everything in the shade. And I lived about 20 kilometers away, and I still felt like I lived in the shadow of the G. A test happens when you're asleep. Where do you find the best match report? A cricketer's backstory is meticulously crafted by a great writer, but it's a day you're not on social media, and so you miss out. We all do this. It becomes almost a full-time job to follow the sport you love. But there is a solution. The emailer Best of Cricket can tell you what the main stories are and the best articles every single day. And when they can't find them, they even write their own. Now, instead of trudging through Twitter or Blue Sky, you can just wait for the Best of Cricket to email or WhatsApp the greatest cricket stories straight to you. Subscribe to Best of Cricket today. The Epping Line was the train from the northern suburbs to the centre of Melbourne. When it started in 1889, it was just a country town. Only 8 years before, local boy Ned Kelly had been terrorising people there with his bushranger gang. However, these days, it's a suburb of little to no interest to those who didn't happen to live there. A mention of it is usually met with, "Where's that?" The line was built originally because locals wanted the city sewage for their farms. Instead, the treatment plant went to Werribee. Essentially, Epping wasn't good enough for Melbourne's shit. Even the first station building was a second-hand import from somewhere else unmemorable. Epping couldn't even get an original awful-looking building. The next station building had all the charm of a shoebox. It was ugly, hot, and depressing. The trains were rarely air-conditioned. They had the requisite tags from wannabe graffiti stars, very few with any actual artistic merit. Chewing gum helped give the seats a little bit more padding, and perhaps most awfully, the train stopped at every single station, not to mention that there are a couple of abnormally long delays at stations like Keelon Park and Clifton Hill. But to many of us who lived out there, the train line was the best thing about being from Epping. This train took us straight from our end of the world suburbs to the MCG. So to us, it was the most special place in Epping. On the entire line, there is very little inspiring architecture or stunning vistas. It's largely overcrowded roads, suburban back fences, a couple of junkies, and the special Merry Creek. There are 20 stops before the city on this 21.2 kilometer journey. Many of them are just other outer suburbs or inner city stations that aren't used much because Melbourne has a tram network. But there are just little bits of sport, like all the mini grounds at Donath Reserve. And you also will head past Preston City Oval, where the Bull Ants play footy and cricket. It's a small stadium that fits about 5,000 people to watch semi-professional footballers. But after a while, you'd also see the sights of a familiar light towers and a famous stadium. But it isn't the main ground. It's called Victoria Park, where my football team Collingwood used to play. Mostly, it was a wretched hive of scum and villainy, but it also once held 47,000 people, but the usual capacity was 28,000. So the further you go, the bigger the ground seemed to get. From Victoria Park, not that many people get on the train. By the time you get to West Richmond, it's almost completely empty. On match days, when the train is absolutely bursting with green and gold for the cricket, or the colours of whatever the two football clubs are, no one gets off at West Richmond Station and no one gets on, because it is the next stop that everyone wants. Straight away, the train goes into a bit of a dip, but there are glimpses of a light tower that just can't be anything else. But you really can't see much until you arrive at the station. For 84 years, this was called Jolimont, and that was a French phrase that meant pretty mount. But that was the name of the surrounding area. The station itself is quite low, meaning that the main attraction for most people is kind of hidden. Eventually, they updated the name to Jolimont-MCG, probably to make sure that the tourists didn't get lost. Essentially, the new name means Pretty Mount Melbourne Cricket Ground. And the little words MCG are the only thing at the station that really lets you know where you are. For most of the year, it's not a platform that gets used all that much. So it was fine for generations to keep very shabby, meaning that it had a couple of old awnings that could barely keep like 25 people dry. It did give it a certain charm, but that old world feeling isn't as nice when you realize that the toilets aren't always open and that most of the time the rats will outnumber the people there. And it's weird because you were just short of the town centre, and the Hilton Hotel is the biggest building around. But the thing you're actually here to see is hidden. People have to line up to get out of the station on match days, and first-time fans often get bumped into because they are looking through the leaves already. The trees try to cover it, but there just isn't a thing large enough to cover something as massive as the MCG. You walk up either on the road or just over the grass of the Yarra Park, which on this day and many match days is a quickly filling car park. Clearly, this is a sacred spot for sporting fans, but it was before as well. Prior to it becoming the MCG or Richmond Paddocks, it was home of the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people. Weirdly enough, as a sporting venue, it had a very similar transformation from a place that people naturally gathered around for sport to a bit of an artificial one. As it did, it grew to an unnaturally large size. Grass is still at its heart, but it's wrapped in thick concrete and throbbing steel. Most fans will know what side of the ground they need to go to beforehand. Otherwise, the trek around it will take longer than the actual test match. The size is incredible, and it's not until you're at the base of it or you end up accidentally walking around it that you realize just how big it is. Lining up to enter for the first time, people always look straight up under a light tower. It seems so high that they might tickle the often overcast sky. Upon entry, you won't see many blades of glass at this point. You're still in the outer ring. Everything is concrete around you. And then you'll go past the beer queues and be offered perhaps a hot pie by a seat-to-seat seller until you're finally at Melbourne's best walkway. Or maybe second best, as there's a pretty good one on the way to the ground as well. But the one inside is pretty magical, if for no other reason that you actually get to see the turf. A walkway that allows you to wander around the thing that you came to stare at. That magical sandy grass. You are right there, in front of it. I've been to that ground hundreds and hundreds of times, and it still blows my mind every time I see the turf. And it's weird because Melbourne, at first glance, can be kind of unremarkable. There are no amazing bridges for tourists to look at, right? No legendary giant rocks to clamber over. No tropical coral reefs to float around in. You don't really get much of a tan for most of the year in Melbourne. Godzilla and other kaiju don't stomp up in Port Phillip Bay in their films. They do it in Sydney Harbour, because that is the famous image of Australia. Melbourne's biggest tourist attractions are clocks out the front of a train station, graffiti walls in back laneways, and a dirty river. It's just a city made up of many different kinds of villages that are quite often great to live in. But it has this one special attraction. A sporting ground. Like a massive, huge, personality-led sporting ground. The Melbourne Cricket Ground. The MCG. Or just the G. And its history is remarkable, right? The first test venue, a stadium that has had the Queen, the Pope, Michael Jackson, an Olympics. It's had athletes like Betty Cuthbert, Ron McEwen, and Sachin Tendulkar all out on it. A stadium that had 130,000 Pentecostal preacher, possibly, patrons on it once. That found 121,696 football fans watching an AFL Grand Final, in which a Collingwood player got knocked out by one of his own teammates. Where Mitchell Starc almost blew the entire thing down when he took Brendan McCullum in the first over of the World Cup final. Where they chanted, Lily, Lily, Lily. Where over 10% of the city's population will often come out for like one match. And a place where more than 3 million times a year the turnstiles click over. It is Melbourne's gathering place. It is where they scream at the night, bark at the day, spend their wages, barrack, sledge, cry, laugh, win, lose, and of course, sometimes draw. It's a place with light towers so high they can only be compensating for something. It builds legends. It's a sporting coliseum that is more than just its concrete, more than its size, more than just Melbourne. In 2,000 years' time, it will be the MCG that defines the Melbourne of right now, either in ruins or, I don't know, as a 4D virtual reality construct. I've been lucky enough to be there with like a handful of other people, waiting for the covers to come off for one of its oldest tenants, the Victorian cricket team, to continue a rain-affected Shield match. And I've been there with almost 100,000 football fans, calling the umpires maggots and singing campy World War I songs as their team beat another team from just down the road. It is special every single time. It's got a special kind of quietness when no one is there, and it is one of the loudest places I have ever been in my life. It can make you breathless with an awe or with a punch. It has its own feel, a Melbourne superiority and inferiority complex all rolled into one. It doesn't need you to know that it's better than anywhere else, because the ground seems to understand that. The first time I was taken there as a child, the crowd called Gary Ablett, a man known as God, a wanker. In fact, opposition players can ask for no higher praise than like 50,000 people telling them that they're a wanker. Gary Ablett, Virat Kohli, Richard Hadley, they've all had this honor. And the first time I saw cricket there, Mike Whitney from New South Wales was storming into bowl, left arm fast. He fell over, and the few people in the ground all laughed at him. I've seen players from Pakenham and Pakistan hit with flags. When it hates really hard. And when it parties really hard. The 2014 AFL Grand Final was another perfect day at the G with a massive crowd and half the country watching it on their TVs. Out on the ground was one of Australia's greatest athletes, Adam Goodes. He was booed. Goodes is an Indigenous star, bred in Victoria, playing the local game, and was the Australian of the Year at that point. He also won 2 AFL premierships and 2 Brownlows, which is the best player in a year. A few years earlier, Shane Warne had to walk out onto the field with a helmet on to stop a near 90,000 person crowd piffing golf balls at the English outfielders during an ODI. The G is like always walking the line, and it's not always on the right side of it. The previous generation to mine was the one who built Bay 13, a massive open air bar that happened to have live sport going on next to it. People used to bring in giant styrofoam eskies full of beer, and they drank until they were finished, even if stumps had been called. And it was there that the MCG did the famous calisthenics with Merv Hughes. It is the same place where most people are thrown out for drunken behavior, sometimes before a ball is even bowled. During the 1990s, the thing to do was to smuggle alcohol into the ground. You'd get like little plastic fruit containers and you would tape them up to your inner thigh with whatever spirit or alcohol you wanted to drink. That is because the previous generation had abused so many drinks that security and police could no longer handle it. It wasn't the only bad behavior. People would bring in phone books all cut up to throw up in the air during the Mexican Wave era. The paper would just be sticking to you all day, and that's because there would be a lot of liquids thrown up with it. You had to hope that they were throwing warm stale beer and not the same drink having been through the urinary tract. But that was always the rumor. And it's easy to get romantic about the MCG and even see those as the wild fun days. But it was racist and sexist and homophobic, and they were all spewing into the East Richmond air as much as adulation and hero worship were. The famous Anzac Day game, perhaps the best event that the MCG holds, would always have a minute's silence spoiled by some dickhead yelling out for their team. It's everything right about Australia at one moment, and then everything wrong about it a heartbeat later. And that might be the reason we call it the People's Ground. It's a catchy slogan that forgets the rights of the Victorian government, the MCG Trust, and the Melbourne Cricket Club. But it's also startlingly true. You wouldn't call Lords with its possessive apostrophe a People's Ground. It is very much the place of the members, as they made clear with the Eton versus Harrow fiasco recently. Eden Gardens is an incredible venue in cricket, but it is owned and run by the Indian Army. Narendra Modi's ground is still in its prop stage, right? The MCG is part of the people. It's made of grass, Merry Creek dirt, sand, concrete, and metal, plus humans barracking. I've always thought if there were to be a revolution in Australia, the MCG would somehow just be involved. It's not that other venues aren't special. It's that the MCG produces its own sounds that I've still never heard anywhere else. Maybe it is the screams rattling around the giant echo chamber or the ghosts of games past, but the MCG sounds different. And there's something weird about the MCG that if it likes you, you become a legend. It doesn't really matter if you are or not. You could be Dennis Lilly or Merv Hughes. You could be Ricky Ponting or Dean Jones. Once they throw their scream behind you, you're it. These days, you can't take beer bottles or golf balls, I assume, into the ground anymore. If you manage to get one in, you'd probably be arrested on the spot and put in a bunker under the ground for life. Melbourne and the G has changed massively. It is now a city of rules and regulation. Everything must be family friendly and sanitized. Walk in with a stroller and you'll be greeted with a full information of how to look after your small children. There is a museum for people wanting to get to the match early, or one of the world's best sports libraries there as well. The people swear less as they leave the ground and are often soundtracked by the sound of classical gas being played by a quality busker. You could still get beer and pies, but the pies can be purchased gluten-free, and the beer is often mid-strength. The beef pies that I grew up with, that quite often had like fish bones and weird things in them and no actual beef, have been replaced with spinach and cauliflower options. You can also get salt and pepper calamari, Thai pumpkin soup, and various vegetable curries. This is because the MCG, at any one time, reflects society at large. Over the years, the seats have gotten bigger. Corporate suites are everywhere now. The MCC has 2 different membership groups. And as Melbourne has got bigger, there's actually fewer seats available within the MCG because everyone wants to be a little bit more comfy than they were before. And there is no doubt that the MCG has transformed from a place of gathering for sport to a place of sports business. A sports marketing masterpiece. Of course, it is still the people's ground, their bucket, pulpit, and canvas. It is the ground my grandfather climbed the fence to see Don Bradman fail in, where my father worked while Sobers made a double century, and where I convinced a girlfriend to muck around with me a bit at the top of the Great Southern Stand. It just keeps changing for every generation. And you don't have to be a sports fan to go to the G. You just have to be in Melbourne. It sucks everyone in there at least once. It's not part of Melbourne, it kind of is Melbourne. Melbourne's stunning concrete anus. And then the game ends, right? And the crowds spill back into Melbourne. Everyone zigzagging towards Yarra Park, pubs, trams, footpaths into town, or Richmond Station. That was the major one, which was busy all the time, even when there wasn't a game. And it's the most used one if you are going to the ground. My station, Jolimont, was an afterthought for most of the years. But at the end of the game, we had our family plan. My dad would tell me, see the Hilton Hotel, if you ever get lost, walk to the right of that. That's where Jolimont Station is. That's our station. The People's Station. My dad was so proud to sign me up as an MCC member when I was still an infant. He wanted me to watch as much football and cricket as I wanted, but also to improve my position within Melbourne society. But after getting full membership, I eventually had to let it go because I moved to the UK and it's been 17 years since I've used it. Everything changes, right? Even where I'm from is no longer the end of the list. The name changed from the Epping line to Mernda, as that is now the last stop. So if you get on the new upgraded Epping station, it still heads to Jolimont, even if it no longer always stops all stations. I'm from Epping, Melbourne, Victoria, Australia, and cricket, right? The Melbourne Cricket Ground is all of those things. We felt isolated when I was growing up, on the verge of a big city, but kind of at the arse end of it. When I was young, we didn't even have a McDonald's or a shopping centre in Epping. Our footy ground didn't have a grandstand. We were just in the middle of nowhere. And then when we finally got on our train to the city, our 21.2 kilometre ride to the centre of Melbourne took an age because we had to stop at every single station. It might as well have been 2,000 kilometres to younger kids. But the one thing that really made us feel special is that we had a direct line to the MCG. The people's ground. Our ground. It took God and the demon to build international cricket. But don't tell Johnny Bairstow. 1882, Australia had played one test in England against the god W.G. Grace, and they sucked. So they were playing him again, and it was a tough wicket. But England was in front, so Australia was desperate for a third innings lead. At number 8 was young all-rounder Sammy Jones. After a routine single, he walks down to do some gardening on the pitch. Grace whips off the bails and appeals. The ball wasn't dead. Jones was run out. The Australians were furious. In fact, some of the English players were also furious. But what Grace said went, and the umpires had already given it. Next in was Fred Spofforth. He was known as the Demon fast bowler. He was furious, and he let England know exactly what was coming next, which was maiden. There's 12 maidens. I can't count them all. England only needed 85 to win. W.G. Grace made 32. England only 77. That was the test where the Ashes began. Buy my book, Overthrowing Cricket's Empire, on Amazon today.